The air in Louisiana did not move that summer. It hung heavy, thick as syrup, pressing down on every living soul that dared to breathe beneath its weight. The fields shimmered under the burning sun, where the sound of cicadas hummed like a warning from hell itself. Somewhere deep in those endless rows of cotton where sweat mixed with blood, a man named Elias looked up for the first time, not at the sky, but beyond it. Because that day he wasn't praying for mercy. He was imagining the sound a blade would make if it ever came down on his master's neck. But before we continue this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. The year was 1852. The plantations of Louisiana were rivers of white, cotton flowing endlessly under the cruel command of overseers who carried whips like extensions of their souls. Elias had been born here, under the cracked wooden roof of a slave quarter that still smelled of mud and burnt tobacco. He never knew freedom, never saw a map, and never read a word. Yet within him burned something far older than education, something primal and quiet that even a whip could not silence. The knowledge that no man should own another. They called him Elias the Ox because of his strength. His hands were twice the size of most men's, and his shoulders could pull a wagon stuck in clay. But his silence made him more feared than his muscles. Where others wept or begged, Elias simply worked. He never looked away when his fellow slaves were beaten. He didn't shout or cry. He only stared, memorizing every face, every scream, every drop of blood that hit the dust. He was building something inside, a ledger of pain, written in his mind, waiting to be settled. The plantation belonged to Henry Caldwell, a man whose fortune dripped from every lash on another's back. Henry had inherited the land from his father, and he ruled it with the arrogance of a king and the cruelty of a child who never learned consequence. He rode through the fields on horseback, sipping brandy from a silver flask, his laughter as loud as the crack of his whip. To Henry, the cotton gin was God's gift, not for innovation, but for domination. It let him process more cotton, faster, with fewer slaves surviving long enough to complain. Elias worked the gin house, an old wooden structure that groaned under its own weight. Inside, the air was choked with lint and dust that clung to the throat like sandpaper. The machine itself, an iron-mouthed beast, sucked cotton through its spinning teeth and spat out seeds on the floor. Elias had seen it tear a man's arm clean off once. The overseer called it an accident. Henry called it efficiency. One night, when the moon rose full and red over the bayou, Elias couldn't sleep. The cries of the chained and the crackle of insects outside blended into one endless whisper of suffering. His mother used to hum an old song when she worked, something soft from her people's past. He couldn't remember the words anymore, but he remembered the rhythm, the same rhythm as the cotton gin's turning drum. That night, he sat up in the dark, eyes open wide, and whispered to himself, "If the machine can eat cotton, it can eat men too." The next morning, Henry ordered a whipping. A young boy named Samuel had dropped a sack in the mud, ruining half a bale. The overseer dragged him to the post while others were forced to watch. Elias stood in the line unmoving. The whip came down again and again, painting the boy's back in blood. When it was over, Samuel wasn't breathing. The overseer laughed and told them to get back to work. Elias looked at the body, then at the cotton gin behind him. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He just felt something click inside him, like a gear finding its place. Over the next few weeks, Elias began to stay late in the gin house. He told the overseer he wanted to fix the gears that jammed. In truth, he was learning the rhythm of the machine, the pull of its chain, the spin of its blade, the tension of its belt. He touched every bolt, memorized every sound. He was a quiet student of destruction, and the gin was his textbook. At night he gathered scraps, broken hooks, loose nails, pieces of chain. He hid them beneath the floorboards, wrapping them in burlap to muffle the clink of metal. To the other slaves he was still the same silent giant. But in his mind, a plan was taking shape, a plan not for escape, but for justice. The first to notice his late hours was Clara, a young woman who worked in the kitchen house. She was smart, too smart for her own safety, and had once been caught trying to read from a Bible left behind by the mistress. Elias didn't talk much to anyone, but one evening when she brought leftover cornmeal to the gin house, she saw the look in his eyes, something cold and focused. She asked what he was doing. He just said learning. Learning what? She pressed. Elias looked up, his face lit only by the glow of the oil lamp. How to make this thing honest, he said. Weeks passed. The harvest neared its end, and with it came Henry's cruelest season, when he made sport of punishing the weakest slaves to celebrate his profits. Rumors spread that he planned another whipping soon, this time to a runaway caught near the river. Elias knew what that meant. He had seen enough. The day came heavy with heat. The overseer gathered everyone near the gin house where the runaway, a man named Isaac, was bound to a post. Henry arrived on horseback, smiling. He took his time, drinking, laughing, making a show of it. You people forget your place too easily, he said, his words slurred. Maybe you need a reminder. He ordered the gin to start running, the sound of its spinning teeth filling the air like a scream. But something was wrong. The machine groaned louder than usual. The belt slipped once, then caught again. Henry turned toward Elias, annoyed. Fix it, boy, he said. Elias nodded, stepping toward the machine. His heart was calm, his hands steady. He reached down to the hidden lever he had built, unseen beneath the platform, a small adjustment that would change everything. As Henry leaned closer, trying to watch what Elias was doing, the sound changed, a sharp metallic clank, then a whirring roar. Elias turned slowly toward his master, and for the first time in his life, he smiled. Henry frowned. What the hell? The rest was swallowed by the scream of steel. The cotton gin shuddered violently, its gears seizing up, and then something snapped loose inside, a blade Elias had modified, drawn tight by the chain. It came down with a force no one could have imagined. The overseer screamed. The crowd scattered. And in the middle of it all, Henry Caldwell's body dropped to the floor, headless, his blood painting the white cotton red. For a moment, there was silence. No wind, no sound, just the drip of blood and the hum of the still-turning gin. Elias stood there, breathing deeply, watching what he had created. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He just said softly, "Now the field knows justice." Clara was the first to move. She ran to him, whispering, "They'll kill you for this." Elias turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the setting sun turned the fields the color of fire. "They already did," he said. "Long time ago." Within hours, chaos consumed the plantation. The overseers fled, the house slaves locked themselves inside, and word spread like wildfire to neighboring estates that a slave had turned the cotton gin into a guillotine. Elias disappeared into the swamps that night. Some said he was captured and hanged the next morning. Others whispered that he lived on among the Maroons, escaped slaves hidden deep in the bayou, building a secret world of their own. But the truth, like the river mist, was hard to hold. All anyone knew was this: the Caldwell plantation never ran again. The cotton gin rotted in silence, its gears rusted and its teeth stained forever red, and every now and then, when the wind blew through the ruins, the old folks swore they could still hear it hum, like a whisper, like a warning, like a promise kept. The swamps of Louisiana swallowed Elias whole. By dawn, the world behind him was already fading, the screams, the fire, the red cotton fields dissolving into mist. His body was soaked in blood and sweat, his breath shallow, his legs trembling. But the swamp didn't care. It took him in like it had been waiting for him. The mud sucked at his boots with every step, pulling him deeper into its rotten heart. Cypress trees loomed above, their roots twisted like claws, draped with long gray moss that hung like the hair of ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of decay and life and something else, freedom, raw and dangerous. For 2 days, Elias didn't sleep. He drank from muddy puddles, ate wild berries, and hid when he heard dogs barking in the distance. The Caldwell overseers had gathered men from nearby plantations, a hunt for the slave who had slaughtered his master with a machine. They rode with rifles and torches, but the swamp was not their friend. It moved, it changed, it misled. On the third night, Elias found firelight flickering through the trees. He crouched low, silent as the fog. The voices he heard weren't white. They were deep, whispered in the language of the old world. When he stepped closer, a blade flashed before his eyes. "Who are you?" a voice hissed. Elias raised his hand slowly. "No harm," he said. just a man looking to stay alive. From the shadows stepped an older man with skin dark as the mud and eyes sharp as flint. Around him were 4 others, men and women, their clothes patched from old sacks, their faces wary. They were Maroons, escaped slaves who had vanished into the bayou years ago, living like ghosts in the wilderness. The old man lowered his knife. Name? Elias. The man studied him for a long time. You're the one from Caldwell's place, he said at last. Words reached us already. They say you fed your master to his own machine. Elias said nothing. The old man smiled, not with joy, but with something close to respect. Then you've earned your place here, if you can keep quiet and work. They led him deeper into the swamp, through a maze of roots and water, until they reached what looked like nothing. But then the ground opened up into a hidden camp. Wooden shacks sat above the mud on stilts, smoke rising softly from cooking fires. Children ran barefoot between the huts, women pounded corn, and the air carried the smell of fish and wood smoke. For the first time in his life, Elias saw black people living free. Their leader was Papa Renard, a man once enslaved in Haiti before escaping to Louisiana decades earlier. He had fought in the sugar uprisings and carried the scars to prove it. To the Maroons, he was part elder, part myth. He looked at Elias like a man reading a prophecy. You've done something no one's dared to do, Papa Renard said that night by the fire. You didn't just kill a master, you killed a symbol. The others will hear of this. They will rise. Elias shook his head. I didn't do it for rising. I did it for the boy they killed. For my mother. For every back they tore open. Renard nodded. Then you did it right. But now you must live for what comes next. Over the weeks that followed, Elias worked with the Maroons. He learned to move through the swamp without sound, to fish with his hands, to make weapons from what the land offered. He found a strange peace there, though his sleep was never deep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Henry's face, that final moment, the blade flashing, the blood spraying across the cotton. Some nights, he wondered if he had become the very thing he hated. But each dawn, when he woke to the sound of free children laughing, he knew the answer. One afternoon, Clara arrived. She had escaped 2 nights after the killing, stealing a horse and following the river until the swamp took her in. When she saw Elias, she ran to him, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. I thought you were dead, she said. Maybe I am, Elias answered quietly. But not buried yet. Clara joined the Maroons, helping with food and medicine. She brought news from the outside, that white men had put a bounty on Elias's head, dead or alive, worth more than a year's cotton yield. Posters called him the gin butcher. Elias laughed bitterly when he heard it. They give me names, but never gave me one that was mine. The bounty drew more than overseers. It brought hunters, men who made their living chasing escaped slaves through the bayou. They rode with hounds trained to rip flesh, men whose hearts were colder than their rifles. One of them was Silas Crane, a former Confederate soldier who had turned his war skill into business. He had a scar down his face, the mark of a knife from a slave who hadn't lived long enough to finish the cut. When Silas heard about Elias, he saw not a man but a legend to be broken. By midsummer, the swamp grew hotter, thicker, alive with mosquitoes and the stink of death. The Maroons could feel it, the danger closing in. Papa Renard ordered everyone to stay hidden, but Elias wasn't the kind to hide. They'll come anyway, he told him, and when they do, they'll find more than mud waiting. For days, Elias prepared. He used the skills he'd learned in the gin house, gears, pulleys, levers. He built traps in the swamp itself, turning the forest into a weapon just as he'd done with the machine. His hands worked with quiet precision, his mind cold as iron. Clara watched him one evening as he tightened a rope made from twisted vines. You can't fight them all, she said. Elias looked at her. Maybe not, but I can remind them that we ain't the ones who should be afraid. The first attack came at dawn. The dogs came first, black shapes slicing through the mist. Behind them, Silas Crane and his men, rifles raised. The swamp echoed with their shouts. Elias waited until the first dog reached the clearing. Then he pulled the vine. A wooden trap snapped shut, a row of sharpened stakes rising from the mud, impaling the beast mid-leap. The others howled and scattered. The hunters cursed, firing blindly into the fog. The Maroons struck from above, arrows, stones, knives. The swamp erupted with chaos. Elias moved like a shadow, silent and sure, dragging one man beneath the water, snapping another's neck in the dark. The screams rose and vanished, swallowed by the swamp. When the smoke cleared, only Silas Crane remained. He stood knee-deep in the mud, his rifle gone, his breath ragged, his scarred face twisted into a grin. "You think this changes anything, boy?" He spat. "You'll die out here, every one of you." Elias stepped closer. "Then we'll die free." Silas lunged with a knife, but Elias caught his wrist, twisting until the bone cracked. The blade fell, sinking into the muck. Silas screamed. Elias didn't speak. He dragged Silas toward one of the traps, a crude device built from wooden beams and a sharpened saw blade, powered by the same chain-pulley logic as the gin he once served. Silas saw it too late. With one pull of the rope, the blade swung. A single wet sound, then silence. When the Maroons found Elias standing there, soaked in blood and swamp water, no one spoke. Papa Renard simply nodded, as if a chapter had closed. That night, they buried the bodies in the mud, letting the earth take them. The swamp went quiet again, but freedom was never quiet for long. Word of the killing spread fast, faster than before. To white planters, Elias became a curse whispered over whiskey glasses. To the enslaved, he was a story told in hushed voices, by candlelight, the man who turned their own tools against them. As weeks turned into months, the Maroon settlement grew bolder. They raided plantations for food, freed captives, burned records, and vanished again into the fog. Elias never claimed to lead them, but his shadow led them nonetheless. Sometimes Clara would sit beside him and ask, "How long can we keep running?" Elias would stare into the fire. "Till the river runs red again," he'd say. By winter, the bounty had doubled. Patrols increased. Even the army whispered his name. But Elias didn't care. He had stopped being a man in their eyes. Now he was a message. And messages don't die easy. By the turn of the new year, Elias had become a ghost story the South couldn't bury. Plantation owners spoke his name only in whispers, and the slaves spoke it like a prayer. They said if you listened close on a still night, you could hear the swamp singing, the hum of the cotton gin, twisted into a song of vengeance. In towns like Baton Rouge and New Orleans, newspaper men printed lurid stories about the butcher of the bayou. They called him a savage, a demon, a spirit sent from Africa to punish the righteous. Yet even among those who feared him, there was a quiet fascination. Because Elias was no longer just a man who had killed his master. He was proof that the order of things could be broken. The government responded with fury. The Louisiana militia was authorized to sweep the swamps and root out every Maroon camp they could find. They burned the bayou from the edges inward, turning nature itself into a weapon. Whole groves of cypress trees were set ablaze, their black trunks glowing red against the night. The flames reflected on the water like veins of blood. Papa Renard saw what was coming before anyone else. "They're closing the circle," he said, tracing lines in the dirt with his finger. "If we stay, they'll trap us like fish in a net." Elias nodded. He had seen it too. But running again meant losing everything they had built, the freedom carved from mud and sweat, the little world that felt like justice. "What if we fight?" Elias asked. Renard looked at him. "You've already been fighting." "Not like this," Elias said quietly. "Not together." Clara was listening. "Elias," she said softly, "if we fight, we die." Elias met her eyes. "If we run, we die slower." That night, under the shroud of fog, the Maroons gathered. Men, women, even children who had known nothing but chains or hiding. Papa Renard stood beside Elias, his voice carrying through the humid air. "They call us shadows. Let them see what happens when shadows move in the light." They prepared with what little they had, stolen rifles, machetes, handmade spears. Elias spent hours rigging traps, studying the terrain like an engineer studying blueprints. The swamp would be their ally again. The same way it had swallowed him once, it would now devour their enemies. 2 days later, the militia came. Dozens of men on horseback, wearing gray coats and carrying torches that burned through the mist. Their captain, Thomas Avery, had been promised a fortune for Elias's head. To him, this wasn't justice. It was business. The soldiers moved in slow, the torches flickering against the water. "Come out!" Avery shouted. "You're surrounded!" "Surrender, and the law will show mercy." From the darkness came a voice, low and calm. "Law had its mercy when it owned my name." Then the swamp exploded. Hidden pits collapsed beneath horses. Arrows flew from the trees. Traps sprung with snapping wood and whirling blades. The soldiers fired wildly, their bullets swallowed by fog. Screams rose and vanished in the dark. Elias moved like a phantom, his body covered in mud, blending with the night. He swung his machete with silent precision, each movement deliberate, almost surgical. He wasn't fighting for bloodlust. He was cutting history apart, one man at a time. Clara helped lead the women and children deeper into the swamp, her heart pounding with every gunshot. She could barely see through the mist, but she could hear Elias, his voice, his commands, sharp and steady. Hours passed like minutes. The swamp became a graveyard. The militia's torches dimmed, their formation shattered. Only Captain Avery remained, standing knee-deep in the mire, his face pale with terror. He saw Elias emerging from the fog, tall, silent, eyes burning like coals. Avery raised his pistol with trembling hands. "Stay back," he barked. "You're no hero. You're a murderer." Elias stepped closer. "You called us cattle. You sold our names, our children, our lives. And now you call me murderer?" He moved before Avery could fire. The machete flashed, slicing the pistol clean from his hand. Avery fell backward into the mud, gasping. Elias stood over him, breathing hard. "You ever seen a cotton gin, Captain?" he asked. Avery's eyes widened in confusion and fear. What? Elias leaned close. "It spins, it grinds, it tears. You built this country on it. So tell me." He lifted the machete. "How does it feel to be the cotton now?" The blade came down. When dawn broke, the swamp was silent. The air was heavy with smoke and gunpowder, the water dark with blood. The Maroons had won, if victory could be called that. Dozens of their own had fallen. Papa Renard was among them, his body found near the burned-out edge of camp, his hand still gripping his musket. Elias buried him himself. No words, just a deep grave and a handful of river stones. After the battle, the survivors knew they couldn't stay. The militia would return with reinforcements. Elias ordered the camp to scatter, groups heading in every direction, taking their freedom to new places, into Texas, into Mississippi, even northward toward the Free States. Clara refused to leave without him. "Where will you go?" she asked. Elias looked toward the river, where the fog lifted like breath. "Somewhere they can't follow." She grabbed his arm. "You don't have to do this alone." He smiled faintly. "I was born alone, Clara. The rest was just noise." She didn't understand. Not then. Elias left that night. No one saw him go. Some said he took a small boat down the river, others that he walked straight into the swamp and never came out. The Maroons carried his story like scripture. They said the water rose higher that night and the fog never lifted again. Weeks later, patrols found what was left of the battlefield: burned trees, broken weapons, and strange contraptions made of wood and iron. Among them was something new, a modified gin wheel rigged with blades and chains, half sunk in the mud. No body was ever found. Years passed. The war came and went. Slavery fell, but its ghost lingered. People forgot the names of the men who owned the land, but they remembered Elias, the man who turned their machine against them. In the years after emancipation, travelers claimed to see lights moving in the bayou at night. Some said it was the souls of the Maroons still guarding their home. Others swore they saw a tall, dark figure standing on the water, watching, silent, unbroken. In small black churches across the South, preachers would tell the story of a man who refused to bow. Mothers would whisper it to their children when thunder rolled outside. "Don't fear the storm. It's just Elias walking again." Because in a land built on chains and blood, his name had become something greater than flesh, a warning to the cruel and a promise to the broken. The swamp smelled like rot and redemption. Cypress roots jutted from the black water like the fingers of the dead, reaching for air they would never breathe again. The moon hung heavy, pale and bloated, as though even it watched what was to come with reluctant awe. Ezekiel stood knee-deep in the murky water, the rusted remains of the cotton gin's gears glinting faintly beside him. His breathing was slow, almost reverent. It had been 3 weeks since the massacre at the old field, where the overseer's blood had turned the soil a dark, sacred color. Now the time had come for something bigger, something final. The word had spread through the quarters like fire in dry grass. Zeke Dunn made the machine of death. Some said it could tear through chains. Others whispered it could slice through a man clean as a whisper through silence. No one knew the truth except Ezekiel himself. In the dense heat of the Louisiana night, he had rebuilt the cotton gin once more, not to harvest cotton this time, but to harvest retribution. Its wooden frame was warped with age, but its new teeth were forged from plow blades, horseshoes, and the shattered tools of slaves long gone. Every turn of its crank was a hymn of vengeance. He'd worked in secret, hidden beneath the swamp willows. Each night he came with his lantern wrapped in sackcloth, the flame dimmed to a dying heart. He spoke to himself while he worked, not prayers, not curses, but the names of the dead. Elias, Ruth, Mary, Thomas. His voice trembled with both love and fury. These were the names of those who had been whipped, sold, or buried alive on this land. For them, he was building not a machine, but a monument. The night the machine was finished, thunder rolled across the bayou like a warning. But Ezekiel didn't see it as a warning. He saw it as applause. He watched the first bolt of lightning strike the river's edge and illuminate his creation, the cotton gin transformed. The spinning blades glistened like a serpent coiled in anticipation. The belts were slick with oil, the pulley ropes wound tight. He ran his hands across it like a priest blessing an altar. "You ain't gonna pick cotton no more," he whispered. "You gonna pick the wicked clean." The first man he tested it on wasn't a slave owner. It was a traitor. One of their own, a man named Jonah, who had traded information for freedom. Jonah had told the overseer about Ruth's escape. She'd been caught and whipped until she bled to death against the oak tree behind the barns. When Ezekiel found Jonah hiding near the fields, his eyes were wide with regret but not guilt. "I didn't mean no harm, Zeke," he'd said, hands trembling. "They promised me freedom." Ezekiel didn't answer. He simply pointed at the machine, its teeth humming with anticipation as the crank began to turn. Jonah screamed as he was pulled toward it, his voice echoing across the swamp, not just pain, but realization. When the blades came down, the sound wasn't metal or blood. It was like the snapping of chains, the breaking of a curse. The other slaves who witnessed it said that afterward the swamp went quiet. No frogs, no wind, just silence. Word of Jonah's fate spread faster than the fever. The plantation became a place of whispers and trembling hands. The overseer, a man named Cutter, doubled the patrols. He locked the slaves in their quarters at night, posted men with rifles by the riverbank, and carried his whip like a cross. But fear is a strange thing. It feeds itself. Cutter began drinking heavier. He claimed he saw shadows moving between the trees, heard chains dragging through the cornfields. One night, his dogs refused to go near the cotton house. They just sat and whimpered, their eyes fixed on something only they could see. Inside the quarters, Ezekiel's rebellion grew. The others began calling him the Jinn Prophet. To them, he wasn't just a man anymore. He was a ghost walking in flesh, chosen by the spirits of the dead to bring the white man's terror back upon himself. Each night they knelt around a small fire, whispering plans. The slaves had memorized the guards' rotations, the time of the overseer's rounds, the location of every musket. They had mapped the path to the riverboats, the route to freedom. But Ezekiel's eyes burned with something beyond escape. He didn't just want freedom. He wanted balance. "Freedom," he told them, "ain't worth nothing if the devils who took it still breathin'." They didn't argue. They knew what he meant. Some prayed for his soul, others prayed for his strength. As dawn approached one morning, a young boy named Isaac crept from the quarters with a message. He'd overheard the white men talking. Cutter was planning to sell half the slaves to a trader from New Orleans. The wagon would arrive in 2 days. Ezekiel's heart froze. He remembered his mother's screams when they'd taken his sister to the same city years ago. He'd sworn he'd never let another wagon carry away a soul from these fields again. That night, the plan took form. The machine would be moved to the cotton house, the same place where generations of slaves had worked until their hands bled. Cutter would come to inspect it before the sale. And that was when the gin prophet would turn the fields into a graveyard. When the morning came, the air was unnaturally still. Cutter strutted through the fields with a pistol on his hip and a hangover on his face. He cursed at the slaves, barked orders, and spit tobacco juice into the dirt. When he reached the cotton house, Ezekiel was already inside, pretending to fix the machinery. Cutter sneered. "You there, boy. Get that thing running. I want it working by noon, or I'll have your back split open." Ezekiel nodded. "Yes, sir," he said softly. He turned the crank. The blades began to spin. Cutter stepped closer, leaning over to inspect the teeth. "That's more like it," he muttered, and that's when Ezekiel pulled the hidden lever. The machine lurched. A chain snapped. The gears locked. And in a split second the spinning blades roared to life, pulling Cutter's arm into its maw. His scream tore through the air like a banshee's wail. The cotton gin, once the symbol of Southern wealth, became a guillotine of justice. Blood sprayed across the white walls, painting the cotton crimson. The other slaves didn't move. They stood silent as Cutter's body went still. Ezekiel looked down at the wreckage, the man, the machine, the history it symbolized. For a moment he felt nothing. No triumph, no joy, only exhaustion. He whispered almost to himself, "The field's done drunk enough blood." But it wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, the guards had heard the scream. They were coming. Ezekiel knew it. He turned to the others. "Go," he said. "Head for the river. Take the boats. Don't stop till the sun touched the water." They hesitated. "What about you?" Isaac asked. Ezekiel smiled faintly. "I ain't running. I got one more harvest left to reap." The others fled through the swamp while Ezekiel stayed behind, feeding the fire, oiling the machine, preparing for the last stand. He could hear the dogs barking now, the shouts of the guards, the thunder of boots. The night was alive again, with chaos, with fury, with history burning itself clean. As the first torchlight appeared at the window, Ezekiel whispered one final prayer, not for forgiveness but for remembrance. "Lord, let him remember what happens when the hands that bleed decide to stop begging." And with that, the machine began to spin once more. The night was trembling. You could feel it in the trees, in the swamp water, in the breath of the earth itself, like the whole land was holding still, waiting to see what Ezekiel would do next. The cotton house burned behind him, its walls groaning under the weight of centuries of cruelty now turning to ash. The red glare of the fire lit up the fields, flickering over the cotton rows that looked less like crops and more like ghosts rising from the soil. The shouts were coming closer, white men with torches and rifles, their voices echoing like wolves in the dark. But Ezekiel didn't run. He stood tall in front of his creation, the twisted, smoking frame of the cotton gin-turned guillotine, and waited. He'd spent his whole life being told when to kneel, when to speak, when to stop breathing too loud. But not tonight. Tonight his heartbeat belonged to no one. He looked down at his hands, scarred, cracked, but steady, and whispered to himself, "Ain't no master left in me now." The first gunshot tore through the smoke, splintering the wooden post near his shoulder. Ezekiel didn't flinch. Another shot followed, then another. The white men were shouting, "He's in there! Burn him out!" The fire had already climbed the walls, licking the roof beams. Sparks fell like dying stars around him. The air filled with smoke and screams, not just from this night, but from every night before it. It was as if the voices of all the slaves who'd ever worked these fields were crying out together, echoing through him, and then, through the choking heat, he saw her, Ruth. Not as she'd been when she died, broken and bleeding under the oak, but as she'd been the night before her punishment, smiling, soft, alive. Her face shimmered in the haze, her voice faint as the rustle of wind through the cotton stalks. "You done what you said you would, Zeke," she whispered. "Now let it rest." He took a step toward her, then stopped. Behind her ghostly image, the world was collapsing. The cotton house roof gave a long, moaning crack and fell inward, sending up a storm of embers. The guards shouted orders. Some ran forward, others stumbled back in fear of the blaze. The smoke turned thick and black, swallowing everything. Ezekiel knew he couldn't stay, not if he wanted their story to live beyond this night. He turned, grabbed the small iron cross Ruth had carved from a nail years ago, and slipped out the back before the flames consumed the building completely. He ran through the fields, his breath sharp and ragged, the firelight chasing his shadow. In the distance, he could see figures moving through the swamp. The others. Isaac was there, carrying the youngest girl, her small hands clinging to his neck. The old woman, Hattie, was limping but steady, clutching a bundle of herbs and charms to her chest. They were headed toward the river, toward the promise of the unknown. But the guards weren't far behind. Dogs barked, horses screamed. Ezekiel could hear the crunch of boots in the mud, the slosh of water, the crack of rifles being reloaded. The swamp, once his refuge, now became a battlefield. He moved through it like smoke, silent and invisible, his body blending with the shadows of the cypress trunks. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of wet moss and blood. At one point he heard a voice call out, one he recognized. It was Sheriff Tully, the man who'd overseen the auction where Ezekiel's mother had been sold away. His laughter was unmistakable. "Ain't no running, boy. You think you can kill white men and just vanish into the mud?" Ezekiel crouched low, gripping a jagged iron gear in his hand, a piece of his creation. He didn't answer. He waited. When the sheriff's lantern light swept past the trees, Ezekiel lunged. The two men collided in the water, a struggle of grunts and fury. The sheriff tried to fire his pistol, but Ezekiel's hand caught his wrist. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the swamp's silence. A flash, a splash, then nothing but the bubbling of the water as Tully's body sank beneath it. Ezekiel stood, chest heaving, face splattered with mud and sweat. His eyes flicked upward. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the path to the river. The slaves were almost there. He could hear the low rumble of the riverboats and the creak of wooden planks. Freedom was within reach, but something in him hesitated. He turned and looked back at the burning plantation, its flames stretching into the heavens like a fiery confession. That land had owned him once. Now he owned its ending. He started walking again, slower this time. His legs were heavy, each step sinking deep into the mud. He could hear voices calling his name, Isaac's, maybe Hattie's, but they sounded far away. Ahead, the river shimmered in the moonlight, calm and wide like salvation itself. The group had gathered by the boats, their faces glowing with a mix of fear and hope. They reached for him as he approached, whispering, "Come on, Zeke, it's time." But Ezekiel didn't step forward. He stopped at the edge of the bank. "Y'all go," he said quietly. "I done what I had to do." Isaac shook his head. "You can't stay. They'll come for you." Ezekiel smiled, not with joy, but with peace. They already came. Ain't nothing left for him to take. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Ruth's iron cross. He pressed it into Isaac's palm. "You carry this, boy. You tell him our story. Don't let him forget." Isaac's lip trembled. "Where you gonna go?" Ezekiel looked out over the swamp, the mist curling like ghosts around the cypress knees. "Someplace they can't follow," he said. Before anyone could stop him, he turned and walked back into the darkness, toward the burning fields, toward the past that refused to stay buried. The others watched in silence until the night swallowed him whole. Then Isaac pushed off the boat, tears streaking his soot-covered face, and they drifted down the river, away from the inferno that had once been their prison. Back on the plantation, the fire had consumed nearly everything. The main house collapsed in on itself, the barn gone, the fences twisted. Only one thing remained standing, the frame of the cotton gin, blackened but unbroken. It stood like a monument against the sky, its blades glinting faintly through the smoke. When the soldiers and deputies arrived at dawn, they found no survivors among the white men. Just ash, twisted metal, and whispers in the wind. One deputy swore he saw something moving near the tree line, a man's shadow, tall and still, watching them. But when they went to look, there was nothing there, only muddy footprints that led into the swamp and disappeared. In the months that followed, stories spread like wildfire. Some said Ezekiel was still alive, haunting the bayou, striking down slave catchers and traders who dared to enter his domain. Others claimed the cotton gin's blades could still be heard turning on stormy nights, the wind screaming through them like the cries of the dead. And among the freed slaves who made it north, mothers whispered his name to their children not as a ghost, but as a promise. One day, they said, the hands that built this land gone rise again, just like Ezekiel did. And somewhere deep in the Louisiana swamps, where the cypress trees grow thick and the fog never lifts, the legend of the Jinn prophet lived on, not as a man, but as a warning. The fire had long since died. Ashes coated the ground like gray snow, soft but heavy, hiding what had been. The sun rose over the ruins of the plantation, golden and calm, as if mocking the horror that had unfolded just hours before. The air smelled of iron and smoke, and in that silence, something sacred lingered, not peace, but consequence. Down by the river, miles away, the freed souls drifted through morning fog. Isaac held the oar steady, his small hands blistered, his eyes hollow from what they'd seen. Hattie sat behind him, whispering old hymns under her breath, songs of deliverance older than the land itself. None of them spoke Ezekiel's name aloud. They didn't have to. It was everywhere, in the water, in the wind, in the beating of their tired hearts. But behind them, deep in the ruins of that cursed land, Ezekiel still breathed, barely. He had made it back to the cotton fields before collapsing. The fire had spared one corner of the land, the old oak tree, the one they'd used for hangings and whippings. It stood untouched, as though the flames themselves refused to go near it. Ezekiel lay beneath its branches, staring up at the morning sky through the smoke. The once green canopy was blackened now, but sunlight still broke through in trembling shards. He tried to lift his hand, but it felt like lifting a mountain. His body was burned, cut, broken, yet his mind was strangely calm. He thought of his mother's voice, humming lullabies on nights when the air was too heavy to breathe. He thought of Ruth's laughter, bright as river water. He thought of Isaac's trembling eyes, full of the kind of hope he himself had lost years ago. And in that stillness, Ezekiel understood. He hadn't built the machine to kill men. Not truly. He'd built it to make the world see, to turn the tools of oppression into instruments of truth. The cotton gin had been a symbol of wealth, of the South's pride, of a system that thrived on broken backs. By remaking it into a guillotine, he hadn't just taken lives. He'd taken meaning away from their cruelty. He'd shown them what it felt like when their creation turned against them. He smiled faintly, his breath shallow. "Now they know," he whispered. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of charred cotton and river mud. The cries of crows echoed in the distance, harsh, ragged, like the laughter of ghosts. Ezekiel's eyes fluttered shut, but in the red haze of his fading mind, he saw something impossible. He was back in the fields again, but this time they were green, alive, and free of chains. Children ran between the rows, laughing. The cotton plants swayed in the breeze like waves of silver. Ruth stood there, her hands clasped, her dress clean and white. "You did it, Zeke," she said softly. "You opened the gate." He wanted to speak, to reach for her, but before he could, the vision faded, and the real world crept back in. The wind grew still again. The sun climbed higher, and then, nothing. The last breath of Ezekiel Jones left his body beneath that oak tree, where thousands had suffered before him. But this time the ground didn't drink sorrow. It drank freedom. When the sheriff's men came days later, they found the plantation's records burned, the owner's family missing, and no sign of the slaves. Only Ezekiel's body remained, charred, still gripping a twisted piece of iron from the gin. They buried him near the oak, but none of them stayed long. The place felt wrong, alive in a way that made their skin crawl. At night, the guards who remained swore they heard the sound of the cotton gin turning again, slow and deliberate. They said the air smelled of oil and blood, even when the wind blew clean. Word spread fast across the South. White men called it superstition. But among the enslaved, it became something else, a scripture. In whispered songs and secret prayers, they spoke of Ezekiel the Jinn prophet, the man who'd turned their suffering into fire, and made the master's tools eat the master whole. His story passed from plantation to plantation, from mother to child. Some said he still walked the swamps when the moon was high, carrying a lantern that burned blue. Others said the riverboats that escaped that night made it north and birthed a new generation. Children who would grow up not in chains, but in the echo of his courage. And years later, when the war came, Union soldiers marching through Louisiana found an old man in the bayou who told them a story. His hair was white, his back bent but his eyes burned with something fierce. He said, "This here land ain't cursed no more. It's watchin', waitin'. It remembers." They laughed at him, called it nonsense. But when one soldier went to the old fields, he stopped laughing. Because there, at the center of what used to be the plantation, the iron frame of the cotton gin still stood, blackened, rusted, and half swallowed by vines. But its blades were spotless, clean, as if they'd never rusted at all. When lightning struck that night, it hit the gin dead on. The explosion lit up the swamp for miles. Locals said it sounded like thunder, but those who lived closer swore it sounded like laughter. And after that storm, the cotton never grew there again. Only wildflowers. Decades later, a small plaque appeared near the riverbank. No one knew who placed it there or when. It bore no dates, no names, only 5 words. Carved deep into the stone, "He turned pain into justice." Travelers who passed that way often said the air felt different there, heavy, electric, alive with memory. Some said they could hear chains rattling softly beneath the soil. Others swore they saw footprints in the mud that led into the water and never came back. But every year, when the wind shifted just right, a faint metallic sound drifted through the trees, like gears turning, slow and steady, the rhythm of something that refused to be forgotten. And so the legend lived on, of a man who took the symbol of slavery and reshaped it into vengeance, who taught the world that even the tools of oppression could be turned into weapons of freedom. Ezekiel Jones died a slave, but history remembered him as something far greater, a spark in the dark heart of a dying empire, a ghost who reminded the living that justice always has teeth. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.